Welcome back, everyone, to our ongoing series on polymer materials in healthcare and safety applications. We hope you've enjoyed the previous series that we've developed, including our recent installment on therapeutics.
In this episode, which will be the last in our series, we will focus on polymers and surfaces, especially surfaces that can kill pathogens such as viruses and bacteria.
We can imagine why this is a pretty important topic with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. But this, really has healthcare implications more broadly than just the COVID-19 pandemic.
So where is this relevant beyond these pandemic times that we're in?
Yeah, so microbial infection is a really big problem in hospital settings.
Yeah, so it has been estimated that 1.7 million of all hospital stays per year actually lead to a patient acquiring an infection during that stay. So something that's referred to as a nosocomial infection. And according to the National Nosocomial Infection Surveillance, this has been exacerbated by growing trends in antibiotic-resistant bacteria. MRSA is the one that's probably known best. And these are bacteria that respond poorly to first-line antibiotics that we tend to use.
Yeah. So what's the relevance of surfaces and polymers to these hospital-acquired infections?
Well, a study in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health suggests that 80% of surfaces in the vicinity of a MRSA-positive patient become contaminated with that bacteria.
Yeah. So that means that many of the surfaces and devices and instruments in the hospital ward will be contaminated with the bacteria. So then when people come in contact with those surfaces, they can propagate the infection cycle.
And does this same concept apply to other pathogens, so things beyond MRSA?
Yeah, absolutely. The focus on MRSA in hospital settings is due to the concern over hospital-acquired infections. These are actually often more dangerous to the patient than the original procedure the patient went in for. However, the same concept applies to other pathogens, both viral and bacteria.
Exactly. And, this is really part of the reason why we're so strongly encouraged to wash our hands frequently, right? We're aiming to limit the spread of viral pathogens, let's say, off of surfaces, right? So an example, in 2020, there was a study in Nature Communications, and it found that both surface and air contamination was present after patients with SARS-CoV-2 infections were in a room.
Okay, so how can polymers help us out here?
Well, it's a really interesting application, right? I mean, so since there's so many surfaces that are based on polymers or contain polymer components, there's substantial room here to improve and enhance the antimicrobial properties of those surfaces. And we can do this either by adding functionality to the polymer. So this would be something which is designed to kill or disrupt a pathogen, or by adding a non-polymeric additive or some sort of filler that is toxic to these pathogens.
Yeah, so maybe before we get too deep into these two approaches, can we talk about what exactly goes into a paint?
Right, so it's a good starting point here. So most paints are really comprised of four components. First, we have a pigment, right? This is going to give you color. It's going to give you opacity. We have a binder, which is typically polymeric in nature. This really helps to form a stable coating that adheres to the underlying surface, but then also disperses the pigment to really give a uniform appearance. We have a solvent, which is what helps you spread the paint across that surface. And then sometimes there's other additives that are included as well.
Yeah, and so these additives can have various functions, so they can improve the adhesion, the flow of the paint on the surface, or as we will soon discuss, that additives can also be either fungicidal or biocidal. So let's talk about the components that go into a typical paint.
All right, so most water-soluble paints, these are typically referred to as latex or emulsion paints. These use copolymers of different acrylic acid and methacrylic acid derivatives. So these monomers are converted to copolymers, which then serves as the binder. This is typically a process that occurs by radical polymerization, but there's other ways that it can be done in principle as well. In the simplest cases, the binder can really be a simple acrylic polymer of, let's say, butyl acrylate, which you can see there in red on the screen, and then methyl methacrylate, which is shown in blue. And these are then combined to form a copolymer that contains both of these monomers, or both of these types of units. So in thinking about this, why would we need multiple different types of monomers in this single system?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Different monomers can give you different properties within the material. So for instance, butyl acrylate polymers tend to be soft and sticky, so they're really good at forming a film, whereas methyl methacrylate can give, rigidity, stability, and potentially even good UV resistance.
Okay, so let's say we take this binder and we add a pigment to it. We can disperse this in a mixture in water to give an emulsion or latex, right?
Right. So this is a bit like when you shake up a vinaigrette and the oil disperses in the water-based vinaigrette, except for a paint, we designed the system such that the emulsion is stable over several years. So that's why we can buy some paint and use it over an extended period of time, weeks, months, years, going forward.
So after we paint a wall, we have our polymers and our pigments. It gives our surface these good optical properties that we're looking for. It gives us a robust film that helps to often protect that surface. But typically we do not have great or really even substantial bacterial or virus killing properties, right? Which is why those surfaces near these infected patients really so often contain these various pathogens.
Yeah, so this is where the additives can be used to enhance the biocidal properties of the paint. If we can add something that can kill bacterial viruses, if we can add that to the paint, this will become a part of the film on the surface. And so the painted surface will now have the same biocidal property.
So in these biocidal paints, what types of things, what types of additives can we use here?
Yeah, so recent work has shown that adding copper to the paint can introduce this sort of biocidal property.
Right, and copper has been known for a long time to be toxic, right? So introducing that to the paint should enable that surface to then kill bacteria by disrupting, let's say, the cell wall around it. And also copper is now, since it's embedded in the paint itself, we have fewer concerns about that copper coming loose and, let's say, leaching into the environment around it.
Yeah, so what about some other approaches? Is there ways that we can change the polymer to make them more biocidal?
That's a great question, right? And so this is essentially the strategy, is to take these components that are biocidal and actually incorporate these directly into the polymer, right? So several studies have really already shown that polymers containing positively charged nitrogen atoms. So for example, the one that we have there in green on the bottom of the screen, these can make polymers react with biological surfaces. So the cell walls of bacteria are a very good example of this. In general, these types of molecules with positively charged nitrogen atoms really can be quite active as disinfectants and are actually regularly used as part of sanitation protocols.
So introducing these sorts of groups into the binder of the paint, which, as we discussed, is mostly polymer, should make the binder itself biocidal and able to kill pathogens upon contact. However, again, these groups are now part of the paint itself, so we're not particularly worried about these toxic components getting out and leaching into the environment.
So, thinking about these advances and things, are these types of paints readily available, or are they forthcoming?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So these sorts of biocidal paints have already been developed and are commercially available from paint manufacturers. We would expect them to be very popular for indoor settings such as hospitals, or other places where there's a substantial risk of encountering pathogens.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of this episode on biocidal paints, and also the end of this series on how polymers impact our daily lives.
Yeah, we hope you've enjoyed and benefited from this series. So for now, we wish you all the best and stay safe and healthy.